All right, Derek, let's get to the NFC wild card slate. A slate that I think we're all pretty excited about. When we were laying out the games and our potential matchups that we could be looking forward to this weekend, I think the NFC felt a little bit more compelling than what we were going to get in the AFC, just because it felt a little bit more wide open.
Yeah, and the lines kind of tell us that. Like I said on the AFC show, I ended up more excited about those games than I thought, and I think some of those lines are a little bit too wide open. But all of these are within like 4 or 5 points, which again, some of the ones in the AFC are 8, 9, 10 points. So I think some of the lines kind of indicate that all of these games feel winnable for both teams, which I think that's exactly what you want on the first weekend of playoff weekend.
I think that's exactly right. It does have a distinct feeling compared to what we're getting in the AFC, even if there are some compelling aspects of those matchups that maybe we're looking forward to that other people may not be thinking about quite as much. Speaking of the lines, all of these games are presented by BetMGM. Like we did with the AFC, we're going to be going in chronological order here. Packers at Eagles. The Eagles are -4.5 in this game. When we were talking about this earlier today, planning out the show, the first thing you mentioned, which I think is worth mentioning, there's a chance that neither of these quarterbacks is coming into this game at 100%. Probably something we should be thinking about before this thing gets kicked off.
It's the only game where this is the case. And what's funny, I feel like in a lot of other you walk into the playoffs and one team just kind of, maybe they were an 11-win team and their quarterback goes down at the end, and you just get stuck having a backup quarterback playing in the wild card weekend. That's not the case this year. We have almost all of these guys healthy, except for this game where Jalen Hurts missed a couple of games with concussion, and obviously the Eagles were just resting everybody in Week 18, so maybe he could have played in that game. Who knows? And then obviously Jordan Love kind of gets the hand, elbow, nerve, whatever you want to call it, injury where he very clearly doesn't seem like he's 100%. So there's a chance neither of these guys are the player that they've been for.
You'd hope coming off of concussion that there's nothing physically wrong with Jalen Hurts and that we probably get something close to 100%. But if there's a chance that this thing is bothering Jordan Love over the course of the game, that absolutely matters against one of the best defenses in the league. Speaking of that, just to set the table a little bit for how these teams arrived at this moment over the course of the year, I think both of us were a little bit skeptical about what the Eagles would be this season, despite the talent that we know they have on the offensive side of the ball, and despite some of the young guys you could potentially get excited about on the defensive side of the ball. This team cratered at the end of last year. You swap out both of your coordinators. It felt like the vibes there might be off enough for them to not get the most out of this talent on both sides of the ball. And I think it's gone about as well as it could have based on the bets that they made this offseason. The offense isn't necessarily significantly better than you would have assumed. Like, they're 13th in offensive DVOA. They have so much talent that I think that makes sense. The idea of Saquon being healthy and being a guy who's talented enough to gain 2,000 yards behind that offensive line, that's not necessarily surprising. A.J. Brown, we know, is one of the best receivers in the league. Jalen Hurts has taken to the offense, I think, pretty well, but they still have limitations when they try to throw the ball. What's happened on defense to me is where this got really surprising. This was an embarrassing mess at the back half of last year. And you bring in Vic Fangio, and I understand that Vic Fangio has a storied history. You don't have to tell me about what Vic Fangio has done as a defensive coordinator in the NFL. But last year in Miami wasn't his best work, and you have a team that was turning over a lot of its personnel. I think you could make an argument that every single bet the Eagles made on defense, the coordinator, every single draft pick, every single guy they brought in free agency has come up heads when they wanted it to. And I think that really is what feels the most different about this Eagles team compared to what we might have expected coming into the year.
And it's not even just the bets that they made this offseason. It's bets that they made an offseason or two ago that are finally paying off for them under Vic Fangio. Like Jordan Davis, I think, is playing better football than he had previously. Nolan Smith is a more useful player off the edge than he was previously. Nakobe Dean, who basically didn't play as a rookie, is a solid starting linebacker for them. So for them, to me, it's like you said, almost all of the guys they brought in have hit, whether it's draft picks. And the draft picks are even crazier because this was kind of almost universally agreed upon as a not very good defensive draft class. Like, a lot of these guys did not go off the board for the first 15 picks or so. And for them to land on probably the best rookie outside cornerback in Quinyon Mitchell, and then a really, really good slot corner in Cooper DeJean, and again, a class that people did not think you were going to get that many defensive stars out of, is pretty insane. And then the other thing, and I think DeJean kind of really embodies what I'm going to say, is this unit felt old and slow and like it had nothing in the spine of the defense last year. That does not at all feel like the case this year. They feel incredibly fast. They feel much smarter, and they feel like the middle of the defense with DeJean, with Bond playing the way that he's playing, Dean giving them something in the middle. It just all feels so much more cohesive and so much faster than they
The
ever
All-Pro
did at any
teams
point
were
last year.
announced about 10 minutes before we started recording this. Zach Bond is a first-team All-Pro off-ball linebacker, and justifiably so.
He wasn't playing the
If
position
that doesn't
last year.
speak to how well these bets have come out for the Eagles, I don't think anything else will. The Cooper DeJeans, and I think you could make an argument also, talking about that defensive first draft. I think you could make an argument that the Eagles have two of the best 5 defensive rookies from this class, if not two of the best 3. Like Jared Verse is, I think, definitively the defensive rookie of the year. We both picked him to win it. You can make a very solid argument that Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean have been the next best defensive players from this draft class. They both play on the same team, and they both play in the same position group for Philadelphia. The Cooper DeJean stat I wanted to throw out, this is per Next Gen. Over the first 4 weeks of the season, which is obviously a small sample, the Eagles allowed 9 yards per target coming out of the slot, which is the second most in the league. After Cooper DeJean went in, and after their week 6 bye, that went to 5.2 yards per target, which was 1.2 yards less than any other defense in the NFL. So again, all of these things that the Eagles tried to do in remaking their defense seem to have worked out pretty well.
That is crazy. Even for as good as I thought that he had been, that is like a completely ridiculous number.
As we get to this game, as we get to the playoffs, I'm curious how you feel about just the state of the Green Bay Packers. Like if you were trying to describe to like my wife, who doesn't understand anything about football, what the Packers are relative to the other teams in this playoff field, how would you categorize them?
They are, as far as Super Bowl aspirations, the you have to be this tall to ride the ride team. Because I think they are incredibly well coached. I think their quarterback, when he's healthy, I don't know if he will be in this game, is pretty good and is always going to give you a fight. And they are a team that doesn't really get blown out in a lot of these games. They really give you a fight because of how well it's put together on both sides of the ball. It's just like we've talked about, they don't have that many stars. And so if you have the stars to just kind of hit a few more dingers in the game than they can, that is kind of the way to do it. And I think you have to prove that as a Super Bowl team, you have the star talent to beat a team as put together as Green Bay. And so they, to me, in a lot of ways, are like the barometer for the NFC. You got to be better than these guys.
Yeah, and I think the gap in talent is the best way to explain that. When you look at the high-end talent on a team like the Eagles and the high-end talent on a team like the Packers, there is a significant disconnect. And I think that you're going to feel that in a game like this, and you feel that when talking about the ceiling that this team can reach. The Packers specifically, I think if you're talking about the way that we frame and talk about a team like the Packers and the way that a general NFL fan might, there's a little bit of a gap. I think on both sides of the ball, you can make an argument that the Packers are two of the more dynamic, well-schemed teams in the NFL, especially after bringing in Jeff Hafley. Now, I think in the same way that Sean McVay has tried to seek this out, Matt LaFleur has found a defensive counterpart that has dynamic, interesting ideas on that side of the ball. Like when you watch Packers tape, it's enjoyable. It's fun. It's like, oh shit, look at that. Like that's a really cool idea. That's why we think the Packers are really good. But I don't think general NFL fans think about the Packers that way because they're less concerned with that. They're concerned about the results and they're concerned about what sort of high-end talent are difference makers when you're watching this team play. And I don't think the Packers on both sides of the ball really have a lot of those. It's a well-constructed team, but it's not a top-heavy team in the way that you'd kind of like it to be when you're trying to win Super Bowls.
Yeah, they don't have enough of the star power on either side of the ball. Like I don't know how many. They're probably their most notable player on defense is Jair Alexander to the average fan, and he's not
Xavier
played
McKinney was a first team All-Pro, but
season.
yeah, I think for the most
part, I guess
Xavier
coming
McKinney's
into
and
he had a lot
it
of
was
picks
probably
this
Jair
year.
Alexander,
Yeah.
but even like guys like Rashawn Gary haven't played to that level. Like the guys who are supposed to be stars on that
Kenny
team
Clark
have not necessarily played like stars, and I think that kind of explains it. And I wouldn't throw the quarterback in this boat, but I just wanted to ask you this. As you consider like where Jordan Love is today versus the way that we were talking about him a year ago, in my mind, and maybe this is my own personal mistake when I think about projecting quarterbacks moving forward, I think that too often, maybe I just innately think that we're going to see a step forward from some of these young guys. And I don't necessarily think we've gotten that from Jordan Love. I think he's kind of a similar range of player to what he would have been at this time last year. And maybe that shouldn't be disappointing, but I think I just kind of built in some progress from him coming into the season as I was thinking about where he fits in like the quarterback hierarchy. And that hasn't necessarily happened. So when you think about Jordan Love, are you a little bit disappointed about the lack of a significant step forward that you've seen from him this year? Like, how do you think about his 2024 season?
I think about him in a lot of the same ways I did last year, which to some degree is a little bit disappointing, right? Like it would make our jobs a little bit cleaner and easier if we could just do the line is going up for young good player continues to get better. That would make things a lot easier. But there was nothing about what Jordan Love did this year that made me think any less of him or like I'm going to be worried about his development moving forward. He is largely the same player to me, and he is still one of the most unsackable quarterbacks in the league, which I think is a very, very
Undeniable.
valuable trait and makes this offensive line look a lot better than it is. Like it's part of why they're able to get away with random fourth and fifth round picks playing on this offensive line. It's because of what he can do in that sense. So I came out of probably last season thinking Jordan Love is the ninth to 12th best type of quarterback. And I think at his peaks, he can play a little bit higher than that and he can be a little bit volatile. That's pretty much how I feel about him this year. And I think given some of the circumstances with them not adding any premier talent, none of the wide receivers really taking the step that we wanted them to. I think Tucker Kraft did, and you can make that argument. And then him having to deal with some of the knee injury for like the first 6-8 weeks of the season. I'm not that disappointed that he didn't take some huge step. And I think what we typically see is quarterbacks really hit their stride when they're 28, 29, 30. He's still got a little bit of a runway to get there. And I think we'd feel good about the infrastructure around him to give him chances to develop. So I still feel pretty good about Jordan Love, even if he didn't take that step.
I think all of that is totally fair. And I think this says more about me than it does about Jordan Love. And I think this a similar player when I think about just my expectations for the season, how the season played out, and where there might be a little bit of a miss is CJ Stroud. And I think too often, maybe I'm looking at quarterbacks and just thinking we're going to see incremental progress moving forward for all of these young guys. If you're a 23-year-old quarterback, you're going to get better as you hit 24. If you're a 25-year-old quarterback like Jordan Love was last year, you're going to be better as you turn 26. And that's not necessarily how it works. Like there are fits and starts with this. Guys plateau at certain times. You can take a step back before taking a step forward. So I don't think it's in a vacuum, it's probably not disappointing. Maybe it's just not how I saw things playing out. But again, I think that probably says more about my inability to project this stuff moving forward than it says about Jordan Love or CJ Stroud.
And I mean, sometimes it might not even be that predictive of anything. Like Dak Prescott is an example of this, where his rookie year it's one of the most statistically impressive things that we've ever seen for a rookie quarterback. And then his second year statistically was like kind of okay. And people were, kind of went back to the well of, did we really need to start this guy? Did we really make the right choice of sticking with Dak Prescott? And then a couple years down the line, he goes on to be a guy who can consistently score 35 points for you and be in the MVP conversation. And so I think that type of thing is still very much on the table for both of these quarterbacks, really, where just getting into that peak of being a top 3 to 5 quarterback after 1 or 2 years of starting doesn't happen a lot unless you're Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes. And so for guys, for the development curve to be a little bit slower, a little bit more ebbs and flows.
My personal impatience continues to be like one of my biggest shortcomings. And I think you could probably throw Jordan Love and CJ Stroud into that bucket. Let's get into what's going to happen or what we think might happen on both sides of the ball in this game. Let's start with when the Packers have the ball. What is the number one thing you're looking for when Green Bay has the ball in this game?
You got to run the piss out of the ball, man. Like it's Green Bay's only way to win this game on that side of the ball. And normally I wouldn't want to say that. Like in ideal conditions, Jordan Love is healthy and you have Christian Watson out there and you can lean on some of the explosive, volatile stuff like that. Okay, well, Watson's not playing in this game and Jordan Love might not be able to grip the football at 100% strength. And so I think you're really going to have to lean on a run game that has been pretty good for a majority of the season. And they've been certainly a high success rate. They can bang out like extra yards in the short yardage area type of team. So I think in a game like this where both teams are going, I think, to be trying to squeeze the life out of the game, the Packers really need to be able to do it. And they really need to be able to do it early and try to set this Eagles team behind and make
the
them
Packers
first.
are the run heaviest team in the league in first half of games this year. And the Eagles run defense has been really good, but this is still the team that plays with light boxes more than any other defense in the NFL. So they are inviting you to play this way. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Packers wanted to play that way. I'm curious what happens when Green Bay drops back to throw in this game, because we've talked about this a lot. The Packers have really, really struggled against man coverage this year. And there are teams that have gone against type a little bit when they've played against the Packers and found a lot of success. I mean, you don't have to really go back that far. It's what the Vikings did 2 weeks ago when playing against this Packers team. And, we think about Vic Fangio and his defenses as these zone heavy, cover 6 sort of teams. And the Eagles have played more man coverage than you probably think they have this year. And I think even more important, there are games where they're really willing to lean into it. They have 7 games this season where they've played at least 40%. They have 7 games this season where they've played at least 33% man coverage. So at least a third of their plays. They have 6 games where they've played less than 20% man coverage. So depending on the opponent and depending on what they think is the best answer, they're willing to do what they need to do. I think back to those Fangio's teams during his time in Denver. Near the end, they were playing a ton of man coverage when he was with the Broncos. So when the situation calls for it, they're willing to play this way, and they're very good when they do. The Eagles are 6th in the NFL in EPA per dropback when playing man this year. So even if it's a little bit outside of what we typically expect from them, they can do it, they're willing to do it, and they're capable when they do.
And this situation calls for it better than any, because what have we said for the last, basically the entire season about the Packers offense is they just don't have guys who beat man-to-man coverage all that well. And I think for as good as I do think Jordan Love is, I think another element of this is like, okay, it's really cool that he's unsackable. It would be cooler if he would run a little bit more than he does. He is a very low scramble rate player, which you don't think,
he is the best athlete who does not scramble in the NFL.
Yeah, for a long time, Derek Carr was this. Derek Carr is a much better athlete than you think he is. He just doesn't run, and he didn't for like a majority of his career. And Jordan Love has a little bit of that to him, where he has the capability to run. And you would think, because he's such a creative player and good at throwing on the run outside the pocket, you would think that he would scramble more. Like if you looked at the numbers, you would imagine it happens more, but he really just doesn't do it. And so I think if we're going to end up in this game where the Packers don't have their most explosive player on the field in Christian Watson, they don't have any other guys who consistently beat man-to-man coverage against anybody, let alone a really, really good Eagles secondary. Jordan Love also can't grip the football correctly, and he doesn't want to scramble. It's like, man, you're really stripping away almost everything that could work about this passing game, which again goes back to like they really need to be able to run the ball and keep themselves in favorable scripts here.
I was curious to look this up just because I wanted to make sure I was getting the good athlete thing right. Jordan Love ran a 4.74 40 at the combine. He has a 35.5-inch vertical leap. Jordan Love, objectively good athlete at quarterback, chooses to not scramble. The last number I wanted to throw out about the man coverage stuff is the Christian Watson element of this, because they've been demonstrably worse from an efficiency standpoint against man coverage without Christian Watson. But I think the more concerning thing is how not explosive they've been without Christian Watson. Per Next Gen Stats, the Packers average a 17.5% explosive pass rate against man coverage when Christian Watson is playing. Without Christian Watson, that goes to 3.6%. So they're about 5 times more explosive with Christian Watson than they are without him against man coverage. And I think that is a big, big deal when you consider this game.
You're not a functional offense with that being the case. And you would think removing a player of Christian Watson's caliber in a vacuum would not be that crazy. But the way that this Packers offense is constructed is like they're greater than the sum of their parts. And every player playing their role is so integral to the way that this thing works. Like if you remove Christian Watson, you no longer have your explosive ability and the ability to throw down the field. If you remove Romeo Doubs, you don't really have your ball winner anymore. If you were to remove like Jaden Reed, okay, well now you don't really have your guy who can do some of your gadget stuff and some of your intermediate route running. If you don't have Dontavian Wicks, you no longer have your most guy who can get open one-on-one underneath. He still is a little bit up and down and doesn't catch the ball all that well when he does that.
He is theoretically
your best one-on-one beater. And so
yes,
he's a separator. Yes, exactly. And so it's like, man, if you remove any of these guys, you lose such an integral part of the offense. And you don't have any one guy. You don't have just like a Mike Evans where it's like, he's so good, it doesn't matter if the other guys aren't in the lineup. And so it's really important that they don't have.
Could we talk about receiving corps like a basketball team, right? Where you need these individual skill sets on a basketball team. That when we conceive of it that way, you need those individual skill sets if you have a team full of average players. Like the 2004 Pistons needed all 5 guys. Well, if AJ Brown is LeBron James, the individual skill sets of the other receiving talent matters a little bit less. So I think because, again, the high end talent isn't there with any member of this receiving core, the individual skill sets become more important.
Yeah, I think probably more than almost any other offense in the
Let's get
league,
to the other
truthfully.
side of the ball. Number one thing you're looking for when the Eagles have the ball in this game.
I'm gonna sound like a broken record here, but it's the same thing. You have to be able to run the hell out of the football. I really think more than
You
any
are the
other game in
youngest
this.
old man in America.
I know. I don't run the football. Everybody's got to hit. Like if you can't tackle, get off my football team. There's just listen. At the end of the day, football is about hitting the person on the other side. And you can scheme up certain ways to do that, and you can get around it in certain ways. But at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. And I think, especially with the way that these two teams are built, it is an absolute
Yeah,
necessity.
and I think that again, you look at what the Packers want to be on defense. The Packers' run defense has been fine this year, but I think the structure of who the Packers want to be defensively, and when you look at the coverages they want to play, is actually a very good matchup against this Eagles team. So in the back half of the year, no team has played more cover two than the Packers. And if you expand that to cloud coverages in general, which includes cover six, so you're playing quarters to one side, you're playing cover two to the other. No team does that more often than Green Bay. And the Eagles do struggle relatively against those looks. Jalen Hurts this season is fourth in the NFL in success rate against single high defenses. He is 19th against split safety defenses. And I think that beyond that, even just the disguise that the Packers use where they're showing single high, they roll to certain stuff, making Jalen Hurts read the game out is not necessarily the best thing that he does. So how do you make that stuff a little bit less important? You just run the ball 38 times. The Eagles this year, per next gen stats, have run the ball against too high looks on 52.5% of plays. That is the highest rate in the next gen era. So playing against the team that plays more cover two than any team in the NFL, I think that this could just be a game where Saquon runs it 40 times, Jalen Hurts throws it 18 times, and the Eagles are willing to live with that.
The disguise point, I think, is even greater than the too high stuff. Like obviously, the too high, them putting a lid on AJ Brown does frazzle a Jalen Hurts a little bit. But to me, it is a lot more the disguise and moving pieces around that really gives him issues because we've seen when Jalen Hurts holds the ball, he's going to take sacks. And that to me is like getting into the backfield, both in the run game and in the passing game, is probably Green Bay's best way to be able to win this game. And their pass rush hasn't been that good for a lot of the season. But if you can just disrupt him for 2.5, 3 seconds and make him think for a little bit, make him bounce, maybe you can get some of these negative plays. But I don't know. I still do feel like if both teams want to be able to run the ball and want to be able to choke the life out of this game, I probably lean with the team whose running back is a little bit more explosive, whose offensive line is a little bit better, whose quarterback can be part of the run game, and that they're going to have a little bit more options, a little bit more answers to do that.
The last thing I want to mention on that side of the ball, if you look at the Packers play a ton of different fronts. They'll play 4-man fronts, they'll play 5-man fronts, they'll play some 6-man fronts. And again, I think that gets back to the ideas on this Packers defense are very dynamic, even if they don't have a lot of high-end talent. The Eagles, I think, are better equipped to deal with those sorts of defenses than maybe any team in the league because the Jeff Stoutland run game tool bag is a very, very deep bag.
Yeah, exactly. Like against almost, if they drew anybody else in this playoff field, probably, I would think, man, some of what they can do up front, just changing stuff, you're probably going to get a couple. Against Jeff Stoutland specifically, it's like they'll probably have this shored up pretty well.
The supporting piece in this game that you think matters the most is who? We're doing this for all the games, and we did them in the AFC. I probably should have mentioned the AFC show is out. If you've not listened to it, it is available for you. If I were a better host, I would have talked about that earlier. In
Yeah,
the show.
a good shout. 25 minutes in when we're at the end of one of the NFC games. But for me, it's Nolan Smith. I mean, if I'm going to sit here and say both of these teams need to really run the ball, Nolan Smith has been quietly a pretty good run defense piece off the edge for the Philadelphia Eagles. And it's funny, when he was in college, he's an undersized guy. He's like a 230, 240-pound edge. When he was in college, you saw his ability to set the edge. But it was like, man, can he really hold up and do that in the NFL? And I think it took him some time to figure out how to do that in the league. But I really do think over the past month or so, you've seen his snap count jump up. You've seen him play a little bit more consistently in that sense. So I think him being very willing to throw his body into the pile, even though he might get bullied around every now and then, is going to be really valuable in this game.
I'm going with Edgerrin Cooper. Speaking of young linebacker-ish players, Edgerrin Cooper's an actual linebacker. I just think that his ability to create negative plays, especially in the run game, you've seen that a lot. He plays like a bat out of hell playing downhill. And I think if the Packers can get a couple splash plays against the run, if it can be 2nd and 12, 3-4 times in this game, I think that would go a really long way. And I think he might be your best avenue to making that happen. And the same thing goes with a sack or two. I mean, this team is not afraid to run simulated pressures, use him as a pass rusher. So I honestly think he might be the most dynamic, explosive piece that the Packers have on defense right now. And I think he'll have to show up that way if they're going to be able to do anything to stop this Eagles team. The other two guys worth mentioning, speaking of players in the spine of the defense for the Packers, Evan Williams and Quay Walker, both limited. Seems like they might be able to play. Evan Williams, the rookie safety for Green Bay, they've missed him the last 3 games, and they've really had to move some pieces around their secondary as a result of that. If they can get him back in there and that allows Javon Bullard to move back to the nickel, I actually think that is huge for just the overall sturdiness and stability of the Packers back end overall.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Evan Williams, if they get him back at safety, lets them play the way that they want to play a lot better and lets them do some more of their disguises. And again, it puts Bullard closer to line of scrimmage. So getting him back would be massive in this game.
You saw Javon Bullard struggle a little bit early in the year when they had him as a deep safety, and then recently when he's had to move back there. So I think that's worth mentioning. And again, it's still going to be a tall order against this Eagles team, but I think that gives them a better fighting chance than they would have otherwise. All right, let's get into Washington at the Bucs. The Bucs are -3 in this game. Our producer, Mike Rebeller, when we were planning the show, asked a question that I think is an interesting kind of entry point to this. He said, is this a house money game for both of these teams heading into Wild Card weekend based on what their seasons look like compared to what we might have expected their seasons to look like? How would you answer that?
For Washington, absolutely. They could lose this game 38-0, and I wouldn't really care. You know, you got your rookie quarterback to do what he wanted. You seem to have landed on offensive coordinator. Dan Quinn seems to have, lifted the floor. Everything else that happens here is house money. With the Bucs, I don't know if that's the case. Like, I still do think that you can make the argument that this has been an overachievement year a little bit for them, especially on offense. They've been incredible. But the Bucs and Todd Bowles are kind of consistently living in this spot where he's coaching for his job every single year. So you actually do need to win these games and be able to attract, if Liam Cohen leaves, you need to be able to have the ability to attract another good offensive play caller. So this to me, them being able to win playoff games actually does matter a lot.
I think I land in the same spot where there's a chance that this is the best version of the Bucs offense that we will see in the Baker Mayfield era because how good of a job Liam Cohen did. I feel like Jaden Daniels is an ascending star. You feel better about just the infrastructure on that side of the ball and what things will look like moving forward. I also just think that Cliff might be around for a little bit. Like, I just think Cliff is really enjoying being back to scheming up ball plays and not having to worry about any of the other nonsense. So I wouldn't be surprised if, as part of this cycle, Kingsbury stuck around for another year in Washington. That guy's still getting paid by the Cardinals. He's still got plenty of money to take whatever Asian vacation he wants over the course of the offseason. This might be Liam Cohen's best shot. And so it really does feel like this might be more of a moment in time for the Bucs offense specifically than it is for Washington's offense, which, even taking into account the point I just made about projecting improvement moving forward for quarterbacks, it does feel like the Washington is on very solid ground with what Jaden Daniels is moving forward.
Yeah, I imagine Cliff is much happier in this job where he has a lot more time for just looking at looking at the chalkboard and being like, man, what if I did this? When you're a head coach, you don't have as much time for that. You've got to put the entire team together. You've got to talk about more player relationships on both sides of the ball, all that stuff. When you're the offensive coordinator and Dan Quinn's handling all that other stuff, it's a little bit easier to just kind of scheme up some of this stuff. And he has been objectively better than he was for a majority of his time in Arizona.
I think that these are the two most fun offenses to watch that I didn't necessarily expect to be that way coming into the season. I've had a really, really good time watching the design, especially of these two run games. What they've done in just the gap scheme run games from both of these teams. And I think both of them are able to do that in part because of both the additions they made on the interior of the offensive lines and the improvement on the interior of the offensive lines. Obviously the Bucs draft Graham Barton, but what Ben Bredesen has done for Tampa this year coming in as a free agent, I think what Sam Cosmi's development has looked like at right guard for Washington, these are two of the best scheme run games in football. Tampa has been arguably the worst rushing team in the NFL over the last couple of years. They are a top 5 rushing success rate team now. And so I think the ideas on both sides of the ball with these teams have been really, really exciting. And that's why I kind of hope that we might be in store for like a 35-38 shootout. And I don't think that's necessarily off the table here.
This one will be a fireworks show. To me, I think Liam Cohen's run game and the Bucs run game has been the most. It's been my favorite surprise of the entire season because, at least stylistically, like I think Washington, what they've done is up there in terms of caliber, but stylistically, it's not necessarily my favorite thing to watch. What the Bucs do in the run game with all their pulls, just beating the hell out of people, all these double teams, it's a lot of what the Lions do. Truthfully, it's like a slightly diminished version of that because the talent is slightly less, especially at the running back position. Even though Bucky's great, but it's about as close to the Lions as you can get.
All right, let's dig into when Washington has the ball in this game. The number one thing you were looking for when Washington is off. The number one thing you're looking for when Washington is on offense on Sunday.
Jaden Daniels has to get the ball out of his hand. And he is good at that. He's been really good at beating the blitz this year. I think he's generally been a guy who does a good job of getting the ball out and not dilly-dallying too much. But I do think there are times where you can flush him out early and he'll hold the ball too long. Or if you can make him get off his read and like kind of confuse him over the middle of the field and push him off of that stuff, you can make him hold on to the ball and he'll take some sacks. That to me is the biggest issue. Is this Bucs defense is really bad, but their pass rush isn't that bad, and you know that Bowles always has the capacity to kind of scheme up some free rushers every now and then. So I think whether or not Jaden Daniels has the ability to just get the ball out of his hands and not take 5, 6, 7 sacks in this game, that is probably going to be the difference to me.
I think it's a really bad matchup for Tampa's defense for this one reason specifically. Washington doesn't have the horses at receiver if you have the capacity to play man coverage and push them around. The Bucs are the worst man coverage team in the NFL. There's a lot of space created in this Bucs defense. And there's a chance, and we'll talk about this, they're getting Jamel Dean back, they're getting Antoine Winfield back. Maybe there's less space for the Bucs than there's been over the past month. But generally, that's how they play. They're a zone blitzing team, and that creates a lot of space within the defense. Jaden Daniels has been phenomenal at exploiting space and playing against zone coverages this entire year. The only players in the NFL, quarterbacks, that have a higher EPA per dropback this season against zone blitzes than Jaden Daniels are Lamar Jackson and Matthew Stafford. And the Bucs are blitzing at the highest clip of any team in the NFL in the back half of the year. And again, they're a zone blitzing team.
And that's incredible company. And MVP, 2-time MVP, maybe 3-time MVP, and a Super Bowl winner. Pretty good for especially as a rookie. And I do think that this is something that Jaden Daniels pretty quickly acclimated himself to NFL caliber with. Like, he was good at beating the blitz in college, especially zone blitz. Like, he was always good pre-snap. And then I thought for the first month of the season, and you even saw in this first game against Bulls, it was like a little up and down, but he pretty quickly got himself to like, yeah, man, if you're giving me zone and I know that 5 or 6 bodies are coming, I'm going to find the answer. And so if they end up doing this in this game again, and the Bucs have been blitzing a ton, there's a pretty decent chance that Daniels just kind of sits back there and has a 2.2 time to throw in this game and is just absolutely shredding them in that sense.
It's funny. The Bucs have created more unblocked pressures than any team in the league per next gen. Against Jaden Daniels, there are times where that just doesn't matter. Like, his
Right.
ability to make guys miss in the pocket has been pretty remarkable this year. So even if the Bucs can get a lot of those, and the Washington's up near the top of the league, I think they're like in the top 5 in unblocked pressures allowed. It just hasn't mattered that much because of what he's been able to do, either escaping and scrambling or just making guys miss in the pocket. The last thing I'd mention on this side of the ball that I think is just worth keeping in mind, in 4 of Washington's 5 losses this year, they have a running back rushing success rate of less than 45%. And if you extend that to games where they won, but the offense was uglier than you want it to be, the Bears game, the Saints game, those are games typically where they have struggled to run the ball efficiently. This isn't about volume. This isn't about if you run for 100 yards, you win the game. The engine of this offense, even with Jaden Daniels in there, has been their ability to run the ball efficiently. When they can't, I think you start to pull away at what this offense wants to be. So even if we have all of those concerns about the air and the coverage and what Washington's passing game can do, I still think that if this is a game where they're averaging 3.2 yards a carry and they're in a lot of second and longs, does that become an issue for Washington in a way maybe we're not thinking enough about?
That type of deal just like introduces the volatility in Jaden Daniels' game with specifically holding on to the ball. Like he's not a quarterback
Yeah.
who throws you the ball that much, but
Sack taking.
it's the sack taking. It's that you can have these games where if you get him into a lot of pure pass, he might make some really good scrambles and he might still make some really good throws down the field, but he will just ruin a couple of drives with horrific sacks. And so that's a
The
really
Saints
good point.
game is a great example of that.
Yes, absolutely. And this is a Bucks team that can play them about as well as the Saints did in terms of that run defense. Like the Bucks run defense isn't as good as that Super Bowl run, but they are like a top third run defense and probably a little bit better than that. So there's a chance that they could stick them in some of those scenarios.
Let's get to when the Bucks have the ball. Number one thing you're looking for when Tampa has the ball in this game.
It's actually kind of similar. It's about whether or not the quarterback is going to hold on to the ball. And with Baker, I think it's a little bit more, is he going to have to hold on to the ball? Because I think the Bucks do a really good job of giving him some easy answers underneath. Their screen game is really, really good. And so they're just not a high A-dot team. But the interesting thing with me is if you look at Baker's dropbacks and you split it up by over 2.5 seconds on NFL Pro, he's thrown 14 interceptions this year on those plays. His EPA per play is actually still not that bad because he's still pretty explosive and his scrambling is decent. But he's very volatile.
Riding the Baker coaster.
Exactly, you're riding the Baker coaster, but he'll give you those interceptions. The problem is Washington has only forced those plays of over 2.5 seconds at the second lowest rate in the entire league. Like they are just not a team. You can get a lot of the easy underneath stuff on them because they give you a lot of air in the coverage. And stuff like that. Like they don't play a lot of aggressive coverage. And so that to me is where this matchup is. It's like, can Washington somehow play against type to get more of those volatile Baker plays? Because I think you need them in this game because the Bucks run game is really good. And when Baker does get the ball out of his hand, he's really good. It's just, can you force him to not get the ball out of his hand very quickly?
I'm curious about the Bucks run game overall. Washington has been a middle of the road run defense. They're not a bad run defense, but they play with some light boxes. They have the third highest percentage of light box rate in the NFL per next gen stats this season. And we know how good that Bucks run game can be. And I think you particularly think that some of the structural elements of what the Bucks run game is can present problems for Washington's defense specifically.
Definitely. I mean, kind of like I mentioned, they are a little bit Lions-esque. It's not necessarily one for one, but this Washington front is okay. But I do think if you can get four hands on a guy, you can start moving them. You can bring some of these pullers where Bredesen is a pretty good athlete. Mock is a pretty good athlete. When they get Tristan Wirfs out in space, he's an unbelievable athlete. Gadecki is a really good athlete. Like all of their guys are really good athletes, and they do enough when you present some of these double teams. So they just have so many options that I think that you can kind of get some of the aggressiveness from. Jeremy Chin's a really good player and a good down safety. He can be a little bit too aggressive sometimes and stick his nose where it doesn't belong. Frankie Louvu is a little bit of the same way, and he'll get into the backfield sometimes, but he'll run himself out of some plays. And then Bobby Wagner, I think, has been good between the tackles, doesn't have the range sideline to sideline that I think that he used to. So there are just a lot of options, I think, for the Bucks to be able to get after them.
I think that's a great point just in terms of range and how this linebacker core is built. Like Frankie Louvu is a hybrid edge rusher linebacker. Bobby Wagner is a good between the tackles player at this stage of his career. This Bucks team is going to make you cover ground. Like that's what this offense is with some of the underneath stuff that they do, the screen game. I wouldn't be surprised to see some play action, like throwback screens in this game, them hunting out some explosives that way. And the other just matchup specific thing that we have to talk about, and everyone has, but that's because it's very fun. The fact that we get Mike Evans and Marshawn Lattimore in this game, and the fact that God presented us with the Mike Evans, Marshawn Lattimore matchup, even with Marshawn Lattimore changing teams, somebody was looking out for us here. Like I'm very, very excited to watch this unfold in an important game on a big stage.
I was scared when he got traded away initially that we were never going to get this matchup again. And the fact that the first possible time that we can get it, we get it again. It's just beautiful. I'm so ready for it. I truly do think a couple of Mike Evans dunks on his favorite corner could be the difference in this game.
The supporting piece in this game that you are thinking about is who?
I mean, I kind of just mentioned him with, the Bucks run offense versus the Washington rush defense. I think Jeremy Chin needs to have a really good game, both against the run when he's in the box, and then I think in pass coverage against, especially some of these screens. But even the Bucks like underneath passing game, he needs to be the guy who really does not allow them to get some of this yards after the catch stuff. So I think for him, it's going to have to be a pretty big game.
I'm cheating here a little bit. This is not a supporting piece, but I think getting him back is a huge part of this game. The Bucks having Antoine Winfield and even Jamel Dean to an extent, we talk about that air within the defense. That air maybe starts to disappear a little bit when the back end players get better. And so the secondary you had to watch with a lot of backups over the last month or so, does it change the complexion of who this team can be when you get a guy like Winfield back in there? Because if they are going to blitz a ton and there is going to be a lot of space over the middle of the field, I think having a guy like Antoine Winfield back as part of that overall formula, that could go a long, long way for Tampa in this game.
Yeah, if you're going to blitz that much, you need your safety to know what's going on in space. And so getting an all-pro
Being a
caliber,
racer to
an all-pro guy in Winfield.
All right, last one here. Vikings at Rams. Obviously, this game is on Monday night, and I'm sure you guys have heard it has been moved to Arizona because of the wildfires that are happening in California. Just a quick aside. Thoughts with everybody who's having to deal with that right now. We have coworkers that have lost their homes, and it's been something that has been in front of mind for us throughout this entire week. So I haven't talked much about it, but absolutely think it is worth mentioning that if you're going through it, if you know someone that is, our thoughts are with you, and best of luck in a time that I'm sure is incredibly trying for everyone who's having to deal with that. All right, let's get to this game itself. The regular season game between these two, these are all rematches. All three of these games. We haven't talked about the first matchup in either of the other two because it was in week 1, and I don't think it matters. Like, I didn't even rewatch the game between the Bucks and Washington, or between the Eagles and the Packers, just because I think these are different teams at this stage. This game I definitely did, because I think there's a lot to take from the week 8 matchup between the Vikings and the Rams. As you went back and you rewatched the first match between these two teams, what were your big takeaways from what you might be able to pick up from that?
My biggest takeaway in watching this game back was the Rams high rolled on everything. Everything that could have gone in their favor to win this game happened. So, like, in terms of like what they did, this was probably their best pass protection day of the season. They were
12%
immaculate, and
pressure rate
they've
per
been up
next
and
gen
down.
for the Minnesota Vikings in this game. 12%.
Against a team that can pressure you a lot, and with an offensive line that had been up and down. They were putting in all these
This
different
is
pieces.
before
They didn't know
Avila
what they
even
wanted
got
to be.
back.
And so for them to have right, exactly. And so for them to not even it just for them to be so fortunate to have the way, and they had a good pass protection plan, don't get me wrong, but for them to have the game that they did in that sense, I thought was a little bit fortunate. Like, again, so they high rolled there. The one or two times Stafford does get pressured, he makes that insane play in the red zone where he wiggles out to his left, ducks under a defender, makes a wicked throw to the back of the end zone. There was a part of me that was like, that was really cool. I wonder if he can do that again. There was another part of me that was like, I don't know how many of these plays Stafford has left in the tank right now. And so again, I just don't know how consistently you're going to high roll on that. And then we also have to remember this was the Darisaw game where he goes out, and the Vikings offense looks good early on while he's in there. And then he goes out and they just crumble. So again, I think the Rams are still capable of a game like this again. It's just that they really have to high roll on everything. And in that week 8 game,
I'm so
they
glad that you
definitely
said
did.
that, because I felt similar when I went back and rewatched it. That Stafford play is a perfect example. Like him turning into Lamar on that play to score a touchdown. And then there are multiple plays in this game, third down plays, penalties, extending drives for the Rams offense. And then that 3rd and 9, like ridiculous corner route that Stafford completes to Puka at one point in this game. Like, I think the Rams offense, the ceiling for the Rams offense is undeniably high. We saw it in this game, but they were bouncing up against their ceiling in this game. And I think that is absolutely worth mentioning. And like you mentioned, I think that the protection plan when Darisaw went out, I thought the Rams did a really good job with alignment and just with the way that they were trying to play with pass protection rules of manipulating how the Vikings wanted to protect in this game. The Vikings, the first couple drives, they were rolling. I mean, they were really moving the ball efficiently. The Rams defense looked like a mess. They lose Darisaw. They weren't running the ball as efficiently later in the game. The Vikings were shooting themselves in the foot with penalties, had holds, drive killing sacks, a couple of false starts, a lot of 1st and 15s. So I think, especially as the game wore on, you had the Rams getting a 5 every time they hit on 16, and you had the Vikings busting every single time. And so I think that probably evens out a little bit more as these teams play against each other again.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And I would imagine so, especially with the offensive side with the Vikings. It's hard to create a new pass protection plan when your all pro left tackle goes out in the middle of the game. Now that they've had some time, it'll
Let's dig
probably be
into
a little bit
individual
different.
sides of the ball here. First thing you were looking for, number one thing you were looking for when the Rams have the ball in this game.
Yeah, so I mentioned they high rolled on a lot of stuff, and they certainly did. And so I think some of that will come back down to earth. But in terms of the stuff that they did that seems some degree of sustainable, for one, anytime Stafford saw cover two, whether it was full cover two or just cover two to one side, he was looking for the corner out. I mean, you mentioned that 3rd and 9 that he throws to Puka Nakua, but he hit 2 or 3 other ones. He hits one in the red zone to Demarcus Robinson, where it's kind of in that cover two void. Like this was something Stafford consistently picked on. He's very willing to make those throws. And the Vikings do run a decent amount of cover too. And so I think that is something that they could end up picking on in this game. And then I also thought in the red zone specifically, the Rams did a decent job of picking on the linebackers in coverage. We even saw last week the Jahmyr Gibbs angle route touchdown. He's beating Andrew Van Ginkel kind of one-on-one in space over the middle of the field. In this Rams game, Kyron Williams did the same thing to Ivan Pace, where he just beats him on a little bit of an angle route and gets into the end zone. So I think some of that stuff is probably the 2 points that I would expect to be some level of consistent or some level of
You
carryover from
mentioned
the
with the
last game.
damage that the Rams did against cover two. The Rams have done that damage against zone defenses this entire year. If you look at it, the Rams are number 2 in the NFL in success rate. Matthew Stafford is drop back success rate against zone coverages this season. He's been phenomenal. Like that's how they want to attack people. Stafford is 27th in drop back success rate against man coverage this year. And in the first matchup, the Vikings played 17.5% man. We mentioned this with the Packers game. They're not afraid to go against type, and they're not afraid to go against type with this sort of offense. Like there are elements of who the Packers are or who the Rams are. It's like, oh, all the motion that they're using. Do you want to play a lot of man coverage? The Packers use motion at the highest rate in the entire NFL. And the Vikings, because of Green Bay's struggles against those looks, were not afraid to lean into them. And I would be surprised if they didn't do that again in this game. The idea that they would play 85% zone coverage again after the way that the first game went and after the amount of man they've shown a willingness to play in the back half of the season, I expect to see a lot more of that from the Vikings because I think they're capable of it. And I think it's probably the best plan against this Rams defense or Rams offense specifically.
I'm all the way with you on that because for as good as the Rams passing offense can be, and for as high profile as some of these receivers are with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nakua, they're not man coverage beaters. And when they are, their best man coverage beating route is like, okay, they run an over route and they're just faster than the guy. But that's not really like one-on-one, just beating the guy in man coverage, all that stuff. And they run a lot of those routes, so maybe that's part of it. But I just think that when you play a lot of man coverage against this offense, you are leaning into the volatility of like you're forcing Puka Nakua to make a lot of these tight window catches. You're forcing Kupp to make a lot of these tight window catches, and you're forcing Stafford to make a lot of those throws. That's just a hard thing to consistently hit on, and they've done it a couple times this year, right? Where Stafford does just black out and have that type of game. Puka Nakua makes all those catches, but I would rather force them to do that than play a bunch of zone and just let Stafford
They
dice
did a
us
great
up all
job,
over
the
the
Rams
place.
did, of pushing air into the coverage. And they did it with a lot of fast motion where they'll change the passing strength right away and then they'll obviously get numbers to one side. And you saw that multiple times in this game. There's one play specifically from the second half I was thinking about where I can't remember who it was, whether it was Robinson or Puka, where they send him in jet motion from left to right. And then they have Tutu had been the number one receiver on that side. And so now he's running a vertical route to that side, and there's just so much space because of what the motion does to those zone coverages. I just can't imagine they would be willing to play that way again. So I think that we're going to see a little bit of a different approach from the Vikings defense in this game. The other thing that I thought was notable, and I don't know if there's anything specific about Minnesota that made the Rams do this. The Rams played 12 personnel on 41% of their snaps in that week 8 game. That is the second highest mark of the season for the Rams, who like to live in 11. We know this. They're like 85% 11 personnel. That is the 9th highest rate of the McVay era on that side. And I wonder, the Vikings play a ton of nickel to 12 personnel. It's like 65% of snaps. It's one of the highest rates in the league. And the Rams, I think, wanted to be able to create some angles in the run game with some of those extra tight ends on the field against light bodies. So I wonder if we see them lean into that again the same way they did the first time around.
I wouldn't be surprised because I do think that is a good point that this is a team when you look at Brian Flores' defenses that are kind of like it, where they want to send a lot of these bodies. They want to do all this funky stuff with some of their fronts, and they want to send blitzers from weird places. It's a little bit easier to have lighter bodies where you can move those guys a little bit more easily, and they can get into the gap that they're blitzing just a little bit faster. And so I think it makes sense that they're a team that consistently wants lighter bodies on the field. Maybe just don't feel like they have a third linebacker personnel to really just put that guy on the field. So it kind of makes sense that this would be the type of game where the Rams are like, all right, we'll just put a second tight end on the field. We'll run the ball a little bit more. And I also think Sean McVay is now more than ever very comfortable chipping away at teams 5 yards at a time, and putting 12 personnel on the field and just doing that against this team.
The last thing I'll mention here, and this is like a very granular point. I have no idea if it has any relevance whatsoever. In this game, the Rams hit multiple like wind back sort of runs where they either had a tight end slicing across the formation. There was a play where they had, I can't remember which tight end it was, but he goes in shuffle motion one way and then kicks back out the other way to create gaps running back to the weak side. The Vikings have had fewer weak side runs against them than any other team in the NFL this year. It's like 35% of total runs against Minnesota are weak side runs. I have no idea if that means anything, but I was looking at some of the numbers that jumped out, especially because the Rams did hit multiple chunk runs, like 12, 13-yard gains on runs back to the weak side in this game.
That is a fascinating point. I guess some team has to be the one that gets the fewest weak side runs. I guess the only thing I can think of is Minnesota likes to
That
send
might
weak
be my
pressures
guess.
at you.
You're trying
And
to
so
avoid
maybe
like
you're just
negative plays.
like, right. And so I guess if you wind back, you're still forcing the weak player to over pursue to the strong side, and then you can cut it back behind him. But that's the only thing I can think of. But that's a really fascinating point. If they do it again,
With some of
that
those
would be
wind
really
back type
impressive.
runs, you're accounting for that edge rusher on the weak side with somebody coming
Mhm.
back across the formation. So I wonder if there's anything involved with that. But I just noticed it when I went back and watched. I think those are two of probably my favorite run designs and hits for the Rams offense in that game. Let's get to the other side of the ball. When the Vikings are on offense in this game, number one thing you're looking for.
I think we have kind of not realized the fact that the Vikings can't run the ball. And I think that we saw that in this last game, especially once Darisaw went out, right? Like they early in the game for their first couple of drives, they actually ran the ball okay, and then they were moving the ball a little bit. Obviously, passing the ball is still a majority of what they were doing. But then when Darisaw went out, and we've seen really for the second half of this season without him in the lineup at all, they have not been a very good rushing team. And I think it's just so easy to see the name Kevin O'Connell and see some of the explosive plays that this team hits and be like, yeah, bucket them in with Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan and Ben Johnson as these run-centric teams that want to set up all this stuff. But in actuality and in reality, this is actually not a team that runs the ball that well. So I do wonder if there's a chance that if you can get them into some of these situations where you're letting the Rams kind of pin their ears back as a pass rushing unit, maybe you can introduce some of that old Sam Darnold
I
volatility
think it's a
again.
great point, and it's one I also wanted to make because there's also been a gap between what they did in the first half of the year and the second half of the year. We know at this point, based on everything we've seen from the last couple of years, that Kevin O'Connell was a positive multiplier for the quarterback in the passing game. And I think ultimately that's the most important thing you can be as an offense. But the running game, each of the last couple seasons, has really faltered, especially toward the back half of the year. So, and I'm not saying this is causal, but in terms of timing, I think that there's probably something to it. In the second half of the season, the Vikings were 31st in the NFL in rushing success rate, 31st. And if you split it into two halves, when Christian Darisaw was on the field for this team this year, they had a 43.2% rushing success rate. When he was off the field, it was 36.8. That takes you from being the Eagles to the Giants. And so yet again, we've gotten to the end of the year, and this is a team that I think struggles to assert itself on the ground in its own terms. And when you have a quarterback that you can send into a volatility mode, not having that run game that you can consistently rely on, I think that matters. And it especially matters against a Rams offense, a Rams defense that you can run on. We have seen teams be able to do that against them all year. They're a bottom 8 rushing success rate defense. So not being able to tap into that against teams where it might be your best path forward, that is a problem as we think about how this Vikings team is constructed.
It is a great point about Kevin O'Connell's the long-term outlook and the overall way about how we view him, because really a lot of these other again, like you said, lifting your quarterback and lifting the passing game is the most valuable thing that you can be. And so the fact that he has that is incredibly important. But I think to like truly put himself in the upper echelon, you would have to have some of the run game development that we've seen from other guys like Sean McVay. How he's developed his run game over the years has been a part of why he's one of the best in the league. And so I think the fact that they've consistently struggled to tap into that as the Vikings, even with different iterations of the offense, with different quarterbacks,
It's funny though,
it is a
because
little bit
McVay
frustrating
had
at
that
times.
2-year swoon where they could not run the ball, and that
Mhm.
actually
And then he became a
And
different
that
player
actually
or a
aligns
different
with the
coach.
last 2 years, I think maybe the only 2 years that Kevin O'Connell was there. So I'm not saying that again, I'm not saying that's
That's a
on
great
Kevin
point.
O'Connell, but that staff, I think, struggled to find
Mhm.
answers. McVay had to kind of go outside of himself to figure out how they wanted to get there, and I think that there's probably a chance that Kevin O'Connell has to go through a similar process. This happens even to really, really good offensive play callers, but it does feel like we're having sort of a similar conversation. This is like a very negative framing of the Vikings offense against the Rams defense. The Vikings still have Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison and TJ Hawkinson. Probably worth mentioning that even if they can't run the ball the way that they want to, there's a very good chance they'll be able to sling it around the yard in this game in the way that they want to.
And better than they did last time because actually in the last game, Addison was kind of a non-factor. Justin Jefferson got his, but the Rams actually did take away a lot of the other stuff, and part of that was because they were able to pressure. The difference is TJ Hawkinson did not play in that game, and the Rams coverage unit, specifically their linebackers, they are quite gettable. And so I think having TJ Hawkinson back in this game instead of it being Johnny Munt and Josh Oliver, who are much more run blockers than anything else, I think having a guy like Hawkinson really could kind of change the complexion a little bit of the passing offense compared to the first time around.
And I think mentioning the tight end is important there because one thing you can do against the Rams is you can put them into base defense by pulling a couple pretty simple levers. They play 84% base defense to 12 personnel this year. League average is 49%. So the Rams are one of the base heaviest teams in the league, and they essentially automatically do it when you play 12 against them. And the Vikings are willing to do that because Hawkinson is such a good pass catcher. So if you can get those linebackers on the field, I think that you're going to give yourself some pretty juicy looks to throw the ball if you can protect. That is the number one thing here.
But
And that's the last thing I'll mention. The Rams in the first half of the season were first in the NFL in pressure rate. First. In the second half of the year, they've been 23rd.
That is very interesting. I thought it would have still been a little bit better than that. You could feel the drop off, but 23rd is pretty stark. But the 12 personnel point is still useful as far as pass protection goes because if you have a left tackle that you need to chip a little bit more, your pass
Yep.
protection plans are going to be different than they needed to be the first time around with Darisaw. It's nice to have 12 personnel, and especially if you have a tight end on either side where you're unclear where the chip is going to come from, that can be a very useful tool for them.
I think it's a great thing to point out, and it gives you more bodies in protection. And they were really good using play action in the first matchup between these two teams. Darnold was 6 of 6 for 87 yards off play action. I expect them to lean into that. And they were willing to live with 2-3 guys out in routes, and they were successful when they were doing it early in this game. So there is absolutely a formula for how the Vikings can be really efficient throwing the ball in this game against a defense constructed like the Rams specifically. The supporting piece you were going to be thinking about heading into this game.
Kind of the tertiary pass catchers for both teams, really. I think we know all the superstars on both teams, but for the Vikings, it's obviously Jalen Naylor. I think having a little bit of speed against a Rams defense, a Rams coverage that will give you some space is important. And then for the Rams, I think it's Jordan Whittington. Sean McVay always needs one player where he can do all the weird stuff with. For a while, it was Ben Skoranek. Jordan Whittington has kind of stepped into that role. And so I don't know how much we'll actually get out of him, but I do think in a game where Sean McVay probably realizes they are a little bit outgunned and probably got a little bit lucky the first time around, maybe we need to dig a little bit deeper into our bag of tricks. Jordan Whittington is down in that bag of tricks somewhere.
I love that. He always does have like one weird guy, one de facto fullback that is actually a wide receiver, and that this year it gets to be Jordan Whittington. We alluded this a little bit. I think if the Vikings can protect, they will be able to throw the ball efficiently. That's going to be the question, and that's why I have Cam Robinson. Even with some help, I think what Cam Robinson and even to a degree what Blake Brandel are going to do against Braden Fisk and Jared Verse, that is a huge element of this game to me. The Rams this season, on drives where they record a sack, are fourth in the NFL in points per drive. So if they get a sack, they're one of the top 5 defenses in the league in terms of scoring per drive. On drives where they do not record a sack, they are 30th in the NFL. So if you can keep Sam Darnold upright and you can keep him comfortable, I think that this is obviously a secondary that you can pick on. And that is going to be the most important question for this Vikings offense.
That has to be one of the biggest vacillations of any team between getting a sack and not getting a sack. That is completely insane. This is truly a defense. I think we all knew they felt like all they have is their fastball, which is let our 5 guys go run after you and go get some pressure. But I didn't realize that the difference between that actually working and that not working was that stark.
Yeah, I think this has been the purest version of what the Rams wanted to be on that side of the ball. So sometimes it's comforting when that happens, when you have this is who they are, and this is exactly who this Rams team is. All right, that is all we've got. Like I mentioned earlier in the show, the AFC version of this podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts, so please go check that out. We will be live on YouTube on Sunday nights, recapping all 6 games. So please, if you're around, if you want to come do that live and get in the chat, which is very lively every single week, we encourage you to do that. I will be tweeting out that link as the last game on Sunday night counts down. For now, that is all we've got. Sincerely appreciate you guys listening. Hope you're looking forward to a weekend of playoff football, because we absolutely are. We'll talk to you guys soon.